So it's this passage right here. So I'll just read it. And further, the monk remains focused on mental qualities. That's Tanisaru Bhikkhu's translation of the fourth foundation of mindfulness. A monk remains focused on mental qualities in and of themselves with reference to the 5 clinging aggregates. And how does a monk remain focused on mental qualities in and of themselves with reference to the 5 aggregates? There is the case where a monk discerns, such as form, such its origination, such its disappearance, and such as feeling, such as perception, such are fabrications, such is consciousness, such its origination, such its disappearance. And then following that is the refrain that we find after a good number of the Satipatthana. Now, before we dive into the actual teaching, I want to invite, I'd like to try to guide us in a little bit of a reflection that points in this present moment experience to what these 5 aggregates are actually describing. This is not quite a meditation. However, you may wish to adjust your posture a little bit. Maybe not close your eyes actually, but let your gaze drift downward perhaps. And again, so how do these 5 aggregates, these 5 khandhas manifest themselves in our present moment experience? So again, just start with the body. Bring your awareness into your body. This is the first aggregate of form. And so you might reflect what raw sensations in these moments confirm for you that you have a body. How is it that you know that you have a body? And within these sensations of the body, what confirms for you that you're breathing? What set of sensations let you know that you're actually breathing? And if your eyes are open, there's also seeing going on. There's also hearing going on. These are all also parts of the body. Maybe there's some smelling going on, probably not tasting. But together these make up the 5 senses that make up the aggregate of the body. The next aggregate is that of feeling, which is the raw experience of pleasure and pain, and of neither. We have some sensations that are neither pleasant nor unpleasant. And so there might be a lot of neutral feeling going on right now, a lot of feeling that's not too pleasant or not too unpleasant. But maybe spend one or two moments and see if you can breathe in a way that you find pleasant. Or notice if there's any tightness in the body or in the breathing that you find to be unpleasant. Or are there any mental states, any mental activities going on that you find to be pleasant or unpleasant? And the attention may feel collected, calm, which is pleasant, or maybe there's some subtle anxiety or maybe some irritation going on in the mind that you might experience as unpleasant. The third aggregate is that of perception, which are the mental labels that we place on things. Labels we place on mental and physical phenomena. So within this collection of raw sensations, you might discern for yourself what label you use to say that there is a body. What label you use to say this is breathing. So what sets of sensations within the body can you label as breathing? What sensations in the body are not breathing? And depending on where you are, you may be hearing sounds, other sounds besides my voice. But notice how the mind is able to perhaps label this one human voice as Carl's voice. Or maybe you're hearing some other sounds and able to label them. A refrigerator, a bird. The whirring of your computer. The mind labels a lot. This is the third foundation. The fourth foundation is fabrications, which is basically our collection of thoughts and emotions. So right now, between my words, what sort of thinking might be arising in the mind? Or what sort of mood or emotions might you be bringing into these present moments? And then the fifth aggregate is that of consciousness, which is basically the raw awareness of what's happening right now. There's the consciousness of what your mind is doing, the consciousness of your body, eye consciousness, ear consciousness. Consciousness of your thought, of your mood, pleasure and pain. Okay, so thank you all. That's just a little bit of a walkthrough of what the aggregates are actually composed of, what it is that we're talking about when we say the aggregates. Now, just to go back to a little bit to our last class, if you're here, you will recall that we went over what are called the 5 hindrances. Now, what I think is interesting is the juxtaposition of the 5 hindrances and the 5 aggregates. I don't know if their placement together in the text was purposeful, but it turns out, in my own practice at least, that they're a very useful combination. And if you weren't here, the hindrances are what you could consider 5 fundamental mind states. And what these hindrances hinder are clarity and composure. That is, the clarity and composure that lead to a deeper understanding of the mind itself. Now, luckily, we can explore the hindrances themselves, in order to gain that understanding of the mind. And the hindrances together are attraction and aversion, torpor and restlessness, and confusion. And with each of the hindrances, there were also 5 inquiries, 5 reflections related to each one. So we inquired whether each hindrance was first present or not present, how each hindrance arose, how each passed away, and then finally, how each was kept at bay. And together, the section on the hindrances offer this 5 by 5 array to play around with. And one way to view the aggregates, the Pali word is khanda, is that they allow us to further explore exactly what the hindrances are made of. Right? So what are these 5 fundamental disturbances of mind actually made of? Well, they're made of the 5 aggregates, you could say. The first is our physical form, these bodies of ours with the 5 senses. The second is feeling. The aggregates are composed of pleasant and unpleasant. The next is perception, so what is the basic pattern recognition going on with each of the hindrances? It's all the mental labeling that we engage in. The fourth hindrance is fabrications. The Pali word there is sankharas, again, which includes our emotional and our thinking life. And very importantly, fabrications, this 4th hindrance or this 4th aggregate also includes our multiplicity of intentions. And then finally, there's the raw consciousness, we are aware of all the experience that's happening through the various 6 sense gates, right? The 5 bodily sensations plus the sense space of mind itself. So when a hindrance is present, and we can apply the framework of the 5 aggregates to investigate what it is, and get a little breathing room around them, and come into greater clarity and composure. Basically experience a release of the mind from the clinging and identification that the hindrance might otherwise create. So let's say, for example, that you find yourself experiencing some moments of panic in regard to the upcoming election. Okay. I'm not saying that's happening, but just, it might happen for some of us. So no matter where you are actually on the political spectrum, we can figure out exactly what panic is by applying the framework of the 5 aggregates. So first, what is the raw physical experience of panic? What actually happens in the body? Second, we can ask what sort of pain that the panic is concerned that we will experience, if the election goes the wrong way. Or we can ask what pleasure that the panic is concerned that we will not get in the future. Again, if the pleasure goes if the election goes the wrong way. That's sort of on the external side, but on the internal side, we can ask what is the exact sort of texture and character, you might say, of panic, that the physical and mental character of panic. You know, what is it exactly? Where is it in the body? What does the mind actually do? The third aggregate in regard to panic is perceptions. Perceptions is it's one of my favorite, actually. And so what, you know, we can ask what perceptions of external reality, you know, what labels, what points of view might I be creating and maintaining such that I create the experience of panic within myself. You know, we can ask what value system am I not just considering beneficial, but, you know, what value system am I clinging to? You know, what sort of us versus them labeling might I be setting up? Or, you know, internally, what specific facets of internal experience, you know, what's going on such that I label it as panic as opposed to some other, you know, mind state that I might experience. You know, how is it that I know that it's panic as opposed to, you know, anger or some other more mundane form of anxiety? And just as an aside, I highly recommend that you check out what turns out to be a 4-part series on PBS. It's called Hacking Your Mind. Hacking Your Mind. And from what I can tell so far, it does a great job of laying bare how our perceptions impact our various versions of reality. You know, it helps us to define where we fall along, you know, in the political spectrum and in the social spectrum. The fourth aggregate is the collection of thoughts and emotions that swirl around. So we can ask, you know, what particular thoughts and emotions is panic composed of? You know, what's the internal verbal chatter that goes along with panic? You know, also what sort of images go along with that? You know, together they make the movies, the stories that play around in my head when I'm panicked. And another thing to consider about this, I think, is, you know, that the stories, the movies, they're all trying to solve some sort of a perceived problem. The movies are trying to achieve something. And then that's where the intentional element of the fourth aggregate comes into play. You know, what is it that the mind is trying to have happen when it panics and kicks up all these thoughts and emotions? And then finally, there's the awareness of it all. That's the fifth aggregate. You know, I'm aware of the mind state of panic, you know, aware of the physical signs, the unpleasantness of it. But alongside the awareness of it, you know, comes the crucial question: what is it that I am or was paying attention to? You know, I'm panicked now, but of all the infinite things that I could potentially make myself aware of, make myself conscious of, what is it in particular that I'm bringing into consciousness such that I'm creating panic within myself? You know, so in this sense, panic is not a given. We could consider panic a choice. It becomes more of a choice and not something that has to be. Okay? So in terms of the hindrances, we might say that panic is a combination of aversion and anxiety, aversion of restlessness. And by using these khandhas, these aggregates, we can break down panic into discrete parts. You know, we can deconstruct panic or any of the other hindrances such that it's no longer one big amorphous glob of suffering. right? And it's in becoming aware of these discrete parts that it's possible to interrupt the momentum of the system, I think. You know, we can find pockets of breathing room, pockets of non-clinging. And instead of being entranced within, you know, caught within a state of panic, we have the opportunity to shake off some of the identification, you know, not be mesmerized. You know, you all may be tired of me using this phrase, clarity and composure, but to me, it's become a sort of mantra. And it points out to me the possibility that we have for ourselves in any moment. With this practice, we can come back to clarity and composure. Now, it doesn't mean that we don't maintain a healthy concern for society and for the people around us, but we don't have to lose our cool. And, you know, by the way, one of the meanings of nibbana is to cool off. So, you know, and finally, this whole process that I'm describing, it's a skill, and I think maybe more importantly, it's a skill that's transferable. You know, something we can apply to any of the hindrances that come up for us. You know, this is something we can get good at and make reliable for ourselves. So that, I think, is the potential of pairing these two teachings, the 5 hindrances and the 5 aggregates. But now I want to provide a little more context about what the teaching of the khandhas is on its own. So the Pali word for what often gets translated as aggregates is, as I said, khandhas, Khandhas. But we also encounter other translations like heaps or bundles. But rather than being something solid like the word aggregate might imply, you know, part of the root meaning of the word khandha is that it's something that's loosely assembled, loosely arranged and collected, kind of like a pile of sticks, but not a pile of sticks that's been carefully arranged. Instead, it's a pile of sticks that's just been kind of tossed on the ground. And in one sutta, Samyutta Nikaya 22, it describes the khandhas, it compares the khandhas, again, body, feelings, perceptions, thoughts, and consciousness, compares these respectively to first a glob of foam, to a bubble, to a mirage, to a banana tree. A banana tree is an interesting one in that it doesn't have any heartwood, it has no firm center, right? And then finally, the 5th khandha is compared to a magic trick. Consciousness is compared to a magic trick. Right? And the point with all these images is that the khandhas, rather than being fixed objects, are impermanent groupings. They're referred elsewhere in the canon as being empty, as being void, you know, without any enduring qualities or enduring substance. But because we tend to see these things as fixed, as enduring, rather than empty, we cling to them. And because of that, they're often referred to as the clinging aggregates, or the aggregates of clinging. These are the groupings, these are the assemblages that the mind clings to. And furthermore, throughout the early teachings, the khandhas are often portrayed to be the dukkha that's described in the first noble truth, the noble truth of suffering. So what that means is that the khandhas are dukkha. Now, not because they're always outright painful, but more in that they're impermanent, they're unreliable, not capable of providing lasting satisfaction. Now, based on this, the Buddha takes us a step further and says that because the khandhas are impermanent, unreliable, not capable of providing lasting satisfaction, then they are not fit to be construed or clung to as I, me, or mine. They're not fit to be construed, not viewed as self. Okay, so thus we come into the aggregates transition into the famous teaching of non-self. In one sutta in the Majjhima Nikaya, the middle length discourses, a question comes up within the texts. And the question is, how does personality view come to be? Right? We do have this view of personality. Well, what is it made of? And then it describes sort of the default assumptions that we carry around in regard to the aggregates, such that we have this perception of self. We have this perception of mine. And what the text says is, as an example, it says, one has the view that the body is self, or that self possesses the body, or the body is in the self, or the self is in the body. Right? And isn't that kind of a correct assessment, right? We do have the sense that there's an I within the body, or the sense that I am the body. I have a body. This body is mine. And the text goes on to make this comparison to the rest of the four aggregates as well. And isn't this how it seems to be? Right? Pleasure and pain, they are my pleasure and my pain. Perceptions, views, and opinions are mine, something to be protected, valued. Right? We have this perception. I am the thinker of the thoughts that I have. These thoughts are mine. We in the West famously say, I think, therefore I am. We're very sure about that. And it seems that there is a self that decides and intends. I am the intender. I am the decider. Right? That we do maintain this sense of volition, this sense of control. That's the marker of a self. When we have this, inclination too, of considering our emotions to be vital, our deep longings, vital, a vital part of me, a vital part of what makes up me. And finally, there's a self that's conscious of it all. The self is the one that is aware. And so crucial to this also, across all of these, is the perception that there's continuity over time. There's some enduring entity, surviving moment to moment. And what the text says is that we cling to these heaps, turn them into versions of self. This is the setup. This is the unquestioned reality for almost all of humankind, and it has been for most of humankind throughout history. So we might ask, might appropriately ask the question, why? Why would the Buddha teach us something that's so counterintuitive? Why would he want to burst our bubble in this way? maybe shake us up to our core? The simple answer to this is that clinging to things as self or mine causes distress. That's the reason for the teaching. The aggregates are not capable of providing lasting happiness or satisfaction. They're impermanent and void. And the Buddha wants to free us of this distress that goes along with clinging to them. Now, if this is a new idea to you and you have a knot in your stomach at this point, try not to worry. I'm going to try to put a positive spin on this before, we get through here. But before I throw you that little bit of consolation, I would like to ask you to hang with me just a little while longer. And I want to give you an example of how the khandhas might be brought into a more mundane circumstance, a more neutral circumstance. You're not panicked. Instead, you're just walking down a sidewalk. Okay? But I'm going to start backwards this time in terms of the list. I'll start with consciousness. And with each one of the khandhas, I'll introduce the perspective, offer the perspective that the act of walking, the various aspects of walking, can be viewed as impersonal in nature. Don't require a self in order to do that kind of action. So you're walking down the sidewalk, and the first thing, first question is, what are you bringing into consciousness as you're walking? Now, if you're like me, you're looking around, aware of sights, hearing sounds. Maybe there are some smells. There's probably not a strong sense of taste while you're walking, unless you're carrying some food. Your awareness could be stable, orbiting around one particular thing. But I think it also wouldn't be uncommon for the consciousness to be bouncing around, wandering from site to site, hearing, one sound and then the next, noticing body sensations. It would also not be uncommon if you were totally lost in thought. Your consciousness is caught in some train of thought while you're walking. So, for example, you're walking down the sidewalk, but what you're aware of, what you're conscious of, is a memory that you had with a relative at Thanksgiving 3 years ago. That's what's in your consciousness as you're walking. And the point of bringing all this together, sight, sound, smells, tastes, tactile sensations, thinking thoughts. The point is that consciousness is highly variable. There are lots of things that we could possibly be conscious of. So the question within all of this is, does awareness require a fixed entity behind it all? Or is awareness simply an impersonal capacity of the mind? So maybe as you're taking a walk next time, check that out. As the consciousness is bouncing from thing to thing, is there one thing behind it all that's the self that's being aware? Or is awareness simply able to happen on its own? The next khandha is that of the Pali word is sankhara, often translated as fabrications. And again, this includes all the combination of thoughts and emotions and intentions. So while walking, one would think that there wouldn't be too much thought to put into walking. There wouldn't be necessarily too much emotional content in walking, right? But, we might ask, what sort of a mood might I be carrying into the walk? You know, our mood may be along the lines of, you know, I'm going to pound this out. I'm going to establish my lines, set my pace, and everybody better stay on their side of the sidewalk, right? Now, this particular approach to walking may not be familiar to you, but I use it because it's very familiar to me. And it's one that I actually have to kind of consciously wiggle myself out of, you know, every now and then, consciously adjust. And of course, walking doesn't usually require a lot of thinking, but it sure is possible, maybe even probable, for us to be, you know, totally lost in thought while on a walk. You know, I'm sure you've experienced this. You know, the legs are moving, the arms are swinging, you know, the sun is shining, the birds are singing, and your thoughts are totally segregated from these other realities. You know, you're, again, thinking back to that Thanksgiving, thinking back to the argument, and having a very strong emotion about something that's not actually happening in the present moment. And just like consciousness, you know, we can have a great multiplicity of thought, emotion, and intention, you know, and I find it really interesting. You know, there's one intention to think about the past, you know, when we're caught in that past argument, or there's some sort of intentional element in that, and it doesn't have anything to do with walking. But underneath that, there is some form of intention to walk, right? Because the legs are, in fact, moving, the arms are swinging. Well, here's the question, you know, while you're reliving that argument, who or what is doing the walking? You know, at some point there was an executive decision to walk, but that, you know, horse left the barn, so to speak, a long time ago. And who's doing the walking now? You know, who decided to have this thought about the past? You know, who created that emotion about the argument? You know, so there's a multiplicity here going on. You know, a diversity of mind, as we've said in some past classes, a diversity of intention. You know, you might perceive it at some points to be, you know, a zoo. You know, there's really a zoo in times in this mind of ours. Or in even worse moments, it's more like a presidential debate. But the question is, you know, what's the enduring center? What's the enduring center of it all? You know, is there an enduring center at the base of it all? So moving on to the next aggregate, the next khanda, that's perception. So again, that's the labeling and pattern making that we engage in. So what might come into play, you know, as we're walking? What sort of maps might we project onto our external and internal environment, you know, as we move through space? So in walking, you know, as we move through space, you know, we see color and shape, of course, but in particular, we see things like tree. We see things like cloud or dog. We also hear raw vibration in the air, but our minds are able to label particular things. So we hear and label things like bird or wind, you know, or siren. I heard one commentator recently remark, the human mind is a pattern finding machine. And it can be fascinating to watch that machine-like pattern finding in ourselves, you know, and just see how this functions, you know, wake up to that part of it. So we can see one kind of shape, you know, and the mind tells us person, right? But as we probably know, it can be so much more layered than that as well. We see not just person, we also see man, woman. We can see old, young. We see races, we see ethnicities. You know, we might label someone as well off or poor. You know, it just goes on and on. Now, with people, we can do a lot of this sort of neutral labeling, but what can also come into play is that we, you know, add a little layer of stereotyping on top of that, right? That we might naturally or easily chalk up to, you know, life experience or common knowledge. And however, we may amp it up a little bit more than that and you know, veer into prejudice, right? Have some labels that aren't so nice. And maybe we finally move up into labels that are clearly mixed with ill will, such that we engage in a kind of us versus them labeling. Now, one thing you may have noticed is that when someone or something is indeterminate, you might say, you know, something you can't put a label on, you know, it gets our intention, it gets our attention. Because, you know, if we aren't quite sure what something is, there's a possibility that it could be threatening. Right? If we aren't sure if something is friend or foe, you know, we find that the mind may linger on it a little longer than some other things. I think it's really, it's a little separate subject. I find it really fun to watch my own perceptions change, especially when it involves a softening of my heart, you might say. You know, I had a very strong opinion about somebody, but then I learned something and then go, oh, you know, I just didn't realize that. And my label shifts and a grudge falls away. And as I was putting together this talk, I was in several moments also in danger of being hijacked and just being interested in talking for a long time about all my misperceptions. Right? That's something that I don't know about anybody else, but I know I could talk for a long time about how I thought things were one way and they were actually another. And some of those ways get quite comical, I think. But anyway, back to the big question, you know, where do all these perceptions that the mind makes come from? You know, we can ask, you know, to what degree did I make the perceptions and to what degree did I just suck them in from the society really without any conscious decision to make them? You know, again, what sort of a self, what sort of a perceiver might or might not be concocting all these perceptions? Or is perception maybe not entirely, but very mostly an impersonal activity of the mind? The next khandha is Vedana, or feeling, the raw perception of pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. So on a walk, we could see a person and have an immediate experience of, oh, they're pleasant. And it could be because they have a nice smile, or maybe we find them attractive, or maybe it's just a cute kid. Right? Or, you know, we might feel the warm sun or a cool breeze, and we have the experience pleasant. Or we hear a siren, and we have the experience not pleasant. And you may have noticed too that attention tends to gravitate to pleasant and unpleasant, but whatever neutral sensations there are, in the sense field, we tend to ignore. Neutral gets, it just drops off the radar screen, even though there's so much of it out there. And another thing about that, similar to that, is that so much of what we register as pleasant or unpleasant depends on how we label things. It depends on how we pay attention, you know. So, for example, we could hear a person arguing, we could be on our walk and we hear a person arguing on a phone and label it as loudness, and thus have it experienced as unpleasant. Or we could, you know, label the argument as distress. And based on that, we might experience some sort of compassionate concern, you know, which in Buddhism is actually a divine abode. It's actually a form of worldly pleasure, or unworldly pleasure, rather. Another aspect of this, you know, we could have the raw sensation of exertion, you know, when we're walking, and it could be labeled as unpleasant because our attitude may be, you know, let me get this over with, you know, or the physical exertion could be labeled as, you know, this is good for me, and therefore we have a pleasant experience of it, right? It's an experience we receive as being enlivening, pleasant in that way. But again, pleasant and unpleasant swirl around and around and are happening, you know, all the time at all of the 6 sense gates. So to repeat the question I've been asking, you know, is there any one particular entity? Is there any single beneficiary of the pleasure or victim of pain? You know, or is it that this soup of pleasure and pain could be considered impersonal in nature? You know, where is the one thing that's the constant receiver, beneficiary, or victim of pleasure or pain? Finally, the last khanda is the body, you know, the body that's doing this walking, carrying around this mind of ours. So, you know, at times you may have this sense that that this body of ours is like the spaceship carrying around the astronaut that sits on our head. And sometimes I wonder, you know, if a blind person has their sense of self spread more throughout their body, because, you know, so much of our sense of sight, you know, I think it so much determines where we think we are within our body, if that makes sense. You know, our head is packed with these, you know, with our eyes, nose, mouth, ears, you know. So much of our experience centers right here. So therefore we kind of think that's where we actually are. One thing that not all of us may know yet, but most of us may, is that this body, this vessel of ours, is not entirely reliable. You know, when we were young, you know, the body provided us with a sense of growth and development, you know, sense of improvement of ourself, you know, sense of possibilities. You know, when we were little, you know, we probably didn't just walk, you know, we skipped, we hopped, you know, we chased, you know, we did little tightrope routines on the tops of retaining walls. But later on, you know, as we're on this walk, you know, the left hip hurts, the right knee hurts, The legs can't quite pound up the hill like it used to be able to. The lungs get out of breath. You know, near the end of his life, the Buddha said something along the lines of, you know, this body is strapped together like a worn out cart, you know, and it just starts going more and more that direction, it seems. You know, but the funny thing is sometimes I think that if, you know, if I wanted to have that clear walking path on the sidewalk that I seem to value so much, if I really wanted that, I should skip down the sidewalk. Because anybody seeing an adult skipping along the sidewalk would certainly give them a lot of room, I think. But anyway, back to the subject. So this body, you know, can seem like me, you know, like I'm the one inside of it, you know, or the body seems like it belongs to me. But it can also end up seeming like a traitor, you know, when it does get sick or injured and when it starts to deteriorate. You know, I can perceive the body to be a little more distant, you know, as it does more and more things that I don't like, you know, as it does more and more things that I didn't give it permission to do. You know, now back to our walk, you know, at some point, as I mentioned before, the body came to know how to walk. It established the intention to be there. But that intention doesn't need to consciously be there at some point, right? We don't need to consciously be there all the time saying, move the left foot, move the right foot, right? We don't have to consciously say to ourselves, breathe in, breathe out, right? You know, if we notice, we can see layers and layers of intention going on that don't have really any immediate link to a sense of self. It's interesting to try this with, might try this brushing your teeth the next time. Notice how your body knows how to brush its teeth and you don't need to be there. Right? Pick up the toothbrush and then your body knows how to do it. The mouth knows how to shape itself. The tongue knows how to get out of the way. You know, the hands and the arms, just they know how to do it. And again, you can be thinking back to that Thanksgiving argument. But the simple idea here is that our sense of executive function, you know, our sense of the one being the one saying brush teeth or walk, you know, can completely vanish, but the body still walks, the body still brushes its teeth. And I bet you've all had the experience of walking somewhere or driving or biking, you know, and our minds are completely somewhere else. And then all of a sudden we find ourselves that we find that we've arrived at our destination. And it's like, oh, I'm here already. Right? So it was like there was some form of taxi driver that got us someplace, got us to our destination. But, you know, we were in the back seat looking at our phone the whole time. Right? So where is the self that's in this? So as with our experiences of pleasure and pain, the formation of perceptions, the generation of thoughts, emotions, and moods, and awareness, you know, all of this, you know, could be perceived as impersonal in nature. Right? Just within this simple example, this simple but multi-layered example, and, you know, where is the stable, enduring entity? The best analogy overall that I've come across about how to conceptualize this idea of anatta, of non-self, is that of a candle flame. So when we see a candle flame, I think we can appreciate that it's taking in the wax as fuel. And then because of the heat, it's constantly combining with the oxygen in the air and releasing, wisps of smoke. So we can see the flame respond to the movement of the air so that it waves and flickers. But, where's the enduring thing there? The flame has some cohesiveness, but it's in a constant state of flux. I think we can appreciate that as we look at the flame from moment to moment, it is not the same thing. It doesn't endure from one moment to the next. And so that's what's going on with us, such that it isn't fit to say that there's anything enduring within us. All right, so I want to conclude by saying that this whole notion is really tricky, right? As a concept, non-self can seem abstract. It can be unsettling. What we thought was stable and reliable, what we thought to be true, we're being told is actually a mirage. So here's what I would suggest. Don't aim your practice directly at the idea that there is no self. Because the Buddha didn't actually teach that there is no self. He didn't make that philosophical, metaphysical statement. He didn't make that assertion. Remember that, again, the Buddha taught non-self as a way to relieve us of a burden. And the burden is that we view and we claim these empty khandhas as I or mine. So that whenever you notice any form of clinging, disturbance, or distress, see if it's related to any form of concocting a self-image or maintaining a self-image, promoting a self-image or defending a self-image, either in your own mind or in the minds of others. Similarly, whenever you notice any form of clinging, disturbance, or distress, see if it's related to claiming anything as mine. My body, my pain, my self-image, my opinion, my group, my emotion, my idea. So as we consider that these bundles that we habitually label as me may not actually be me, it's not as if you're going to disappear. That's not something that you have to worry about. After the Buddha's awakening, he still had these aggregates, but he just didn't cling to them. And as with us, we will still have thoughts and intentions and awareness going on. We'll still have sights and sounds and smells and tactile sensations. It's just that we won't be burdened by the agenda of propping up and defending this hologram. So again, it's not that you'll disappear, right? Instead, the ballast gets discarded. So in that sense, maybe aggregate is a good term, for what we let fall away. Okay, so that is a lot. That's all I wanted to say. I thank you for your attention and your patience. Patience probably required there a little bit, but I hope this has been helpful. And we have a good 20 minutes or so for questions and comments. I'd love to hear from you all about this. And I guess the idea is if you have a question or comment, just unmute yourself. Either that was so totally clear that nobody has any comments, or you're so completely confused you just don't even know where to start. Or something in between, anyway.
Carl, Luke here. I'd to respond to that by saying, you know, the old story of a student coming to a Buddhist master after a Dharma talk and saying, oh, you know, you cleared things up for me so well, and the master saying that it must have not have been a good presentation. Thank you so much for your talk. I have to say I do fall in the confused camp, but that's because I'm still so very near the beginning of my journey here. So I think you know, your words will become clearer in time.
Yes, just again, don't take this whole non-self thing as a piece of doctrine that you just have to sort of lock into. Just experiment with letting go of the distress that can come from claiming these things as, you know, making them into a self, claiming them as mine. Just little by little, you know, in this arena, in that arena, and you know, see where the relief comes into play. And that's basically the idea, is to relieve ourselves. I gotta, just to share my own bit, you know, as I was putting together this talk, it did, I'll admit, arise every now and then. You know, I'm getting this really messed up, and but of course the teaching here is that don't think of it as a personal problem. You know, I'll put together the talk as best as I can, but I don't have to add a layer of suffering on top of it by, you know, turning it into, you know, Carl's bad talk or, you know, indiscernible talk or whatever it is. That, just so you know too, this is the talk that I think most Dhamma teachers dread. If you're going to dread giving a talk, this is the one. Anyway, yes, Greg.
Hey, Carl.
Hey.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your understanding of the distinction between like form and perception. I think when I think about what I'm doing in meditation, I think about playing with perception regarding body sensations in form. So I think before this talk, I thought I had a handle on what form was, but now I'm thinking, why isn't that just perception of form? Like if I feel a tingling, that seems like a perception of form, and it seems like I can play with that perception, like maybe that tingling is my nose. Maybe that tingling is just an awareness of a tactile sensation. But then what's form?
My understanding is that the form is basically the body itself, with all of its sensations, the eye sense, the bodily sense, the raw sensation of, you know, feeling tingling, not feeling in terms of Vedana, but the experience of tingling. And then there's the perception of tingling and being able to label tingling as something different from pressure or warmth right? Or coolness. And I don't, maybe you could say more about how you play around with perceptions, but I think that's a very, pointing to the idea that we can play with perceptions, I think is a great one to experiment with in our practice, because perceptions are not set, right? We could, and I tried to get into this a little bit in the introductory meditation. What specific raw sensations of the body can we label as breathing, as opposed to some sort of a sensation we might be happen to have on our backside because it's getting a little, painful? Is that breathing? Probably, that we're probably not going to label that breathing. And then there's this whole range of, what gets labeled as pleasure or pain, right? Our experience of pleasure and pain, as I tried to get the point across, depends a lot on how we label things. So in that sense, a lot of what we experience as pleasure and pain is a choice. Does that help at all?
It does. Thank you. I mean, I think, would it be right to say that it's thinking of form would be like raw sensation?
Yeah.
Something like that.
It's the raw contact. Think of it as raw contact.
Okay.
There's contact. Then, if you're talking about dependent origination, we have the raw contact.
But then that seems very similar to what consciousness is, right? It's like the raw contact of.
But remember that consciousness comes in. Without consciousness, there is no contact.
Right. Contact
involves the organ, the consciousness, and then the form. There's the body, there's the consciousness of it. There's the I, there's the form that we see, and then there's the actual consciousness, I consciousness behind it.
Right.
So
right.
Three things coming together.
Thank you, Carl.
Yes, Alex.
You referred earlier to bringing something into consciousness. And then you talked about how we have a choice to deal with that. And the process from perception and thought to consciousness seems seamless to me. I don't understand at what point there's a decision.
There's as I was describing each of the khandhas, you probably noticed that I was bringing in others as well. So there aren't hard and fast lines between the two. It's more like what facet of a particular experience are we kind of focusing on in any one moment. What we become conscious of depends on an intentional action that may or may not be conscious. But with this practice, we can bring more and more into consciousness. I should say more and more into clear comprehension, to take it back to what goes into the mindfulness of the early tradition, right? We have sati, which is this whole mindfulness thing. We bring something to mind. There's an intentional element in bringing something to mind. And then we clearly comprehend it, which is kind of related to consciousness, kind of related to attention.
I can see where the comprehension would be. The intention is something that I haven't experienced. At least I'm not aware of experienced.
Yeah. If you sit down and you say, I'm going to pay attention to my breath, right? That's an act of mindfulness, of breathing.
Mm-hmm.
And once you brought the breath to mind through having that intention, you can clearly you can become conscious of the sensations of breathing and clearly comprehend the breathing process itself.
I can initiate the intention, but I'm not in control of maintaining it.
Well, that can come with practice. And that's where becoming more aware of our intentions, being mindful of intentions, that's where I think you might say where habitual attention or habitual intention comes into play with mindful or conscious intention, right? We have all this baggage that we bring into any moment, based on our past karma. We're loaded with all these past intentions that we didn't really seem to create, right? We're walking around, our minds are wandering, that's past baggage. But what we can do in the present moment is be intentional about what we bring to mind. And keep that in line with what's skillful and what's not skillful, right? To kind of keep going back to some of the three main parts of, that are at the beginning of the Satipatthana. Sati or mindfulness, clear comprehension, and ardency. In being mindful, we want to bring to mind and clearly comprehend things that help us, and not let our past conditioning establish, the way things are.
Okay, thank you, Carl.
A lot of our practice is just starting to, again, to sort of parse this stuff out. And what the Buddha is doing is giving us a language to parse this stuff out, to make these parts a little more discrete than they might otherwise be. And they aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, right? They are actually all happening at the same time. So it's a little bit like, holding up a gemstone and looking at, turning it and just catching, or looking at different facets of this thing at any particular point in time. Yes, Garrett.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're kind of low.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of low. I'm a long way away.
Mm-hmm.
I'm in France, so anyway.
Oh gosh.
It's great to see you.
Hey, you too.
It's really been a long time, and I saw you were doing this, and I had to listen, and I'm glad I did. You really presented things well, and I always love the way you present it in our past conversations. But while you were talking, there's something that I've been looking at in many different ways, and it's this thing of resistance. Resistance. I used to think of resistance. We resisted things, when they were negative or somehow. But now it seems resistance. I'm trying to listen as you were talking, how that plays in, maybe how even holding on to positive things, and holding things, as a form of resistance that keeps us, it seems to me that it keeps us from being present, or keeps me from being present when there's a holding. And I guess, we're talking about clinging. Maybe it's the same thing. Can you hear me?
Just barely.
Really? Can't hear me?
I'm getting most of it, but
It's kind of simple in a way, really. I think it seems that, and resistance maybe is just another term that I'm using, but it's, it might be a form of clinging or holding, and but it keeps me from being in the present moment, and I somehow resist. I think some of it can go back to that equation of pain times resistance equals suffering. But resistance seems to be on different layers, even forced positive thinking, or somehow. I don't know if that makes sense, but
you're wondering about where resistance comes into play here?
well, it seems to be. I think it's a form of clinging.
Yeah, that seems to be a little bit confusing in that we're resisting something. It seems to be the opposite of clinging to it, right?
But even holding, like something pleasurable, even holding something pleasurable can be a type of resistance to what is.
Right,
Because what is, you're holding to what is, even though it seems pleasurable or something, it's still a type of resistance, I think, to what is. So it's certainly not being present.
I think with the hindrances and with the aggregates, we start to have these, again, sort of ways of breaking down what it is exactly we might be resisting, or what we might be attracted to. In either way, in either sense, it's a form of imbalance. Is it a physical sensation that I'm resisting? Is it what out there, or what inside me am I finding pleasurable and getting attracted to, or finding unpleasurable and getting repelled by? And in either case, just examine the clinging and see if that clinging can be released. And then one thing that occurred to me recently as I was revisiting one of my favorite hindrances, the one of those ones that just keeps coming up again and again. It has to do with self-image, right? A kind of a common work situation. Am I going to mess this task up? How am I being viewed? And seeing this for the 30th, 50th, 100th time, it starts to get a little boring, right? It's at some point, as we clearly comprehend, not just allow ourselves to get identified yet again, but clearly comprehend what's going on and be able to name it, as in my case, worrying about my self-image, it comes to be a case of familiarity breeds contempt, right? It's just, I just get a little, not fed up, but just don't see the value in going through that again. And then the mind, can release, rather than prying my grip off of it. It's just like, it's not worth it. seeing that. And I think the same process, the same dynamic could come into play with any number of other types of mind states, or ones that cause us trouble.